Good afternoon, and welcome to the award-winning third season of Raising the NSBAR. I'm Jeff Lasky, the CEO of this great organization, the North Shore-Barrington Association of Realtors. I hope you are continuing to stay safe and healthy. Just a couple of quick reminders. Managing brokers, you need to get your continuing education requirement completed. If you've not done so yet and still need to register for classes, our NSBAR team can help. Call us at 847-480-7177 as soon as you can so you don't run into any issues keeping your license active. Also, there's one date left for the Illinois Realtors Virtual Lobby Days. Monday afternoon, May 3rd. It will be an hour, currently scheduled for 3 p.m., and we'll be meeting with House Minority Leader Jim Durkin and Senate Minority Leader Dan McConkey. As an incentive to attend, Illinois Realtors is sending members a $20 gift card for each lobby session attended in its entirety. Go to the website on the screen for more information and to register. We have a powerhouse guest this week on Raising the NSBAR. As you all know, April is Fair Housing Month. Here at NSBAR, we have really ramped up our efforts this year to help with education and awareness about fair housing, diversity, and inclusivity issues. I hope you've had a chance to catch the racial wealth gap and homeownership presentation, which was on right before us today. I am now going to follow up by spending a few minutes with a real fair housing expert, Alexia Smokler. Alexia is the Senior Policy Representative for Fair Housing at the National Association of Realtors. She represents NAR on fair housing-related federal regulatory and legislative matters and provides subject matter expertise to NAR training, research, and publications. Alexia was NAR's project manager for Fairhaven, a fair housing simulation. Before joining NAR, she worked in fair housing enforcement at HUD's Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity, on a congressional staff, and with nonprofit civil rights organizations. Very impressive. Good afternoon, Alexia.
Thank you. It's so great to be with you, Jeff.
Yeah, well, thanks for joining us, especially during what I imagine might be a pretty busy time of the year for you. Mm-hmm. All right, so here's where I want to start, because everybody I've talked to, you're the one to blame for how tough Fairhaven is. So seriously, it's one of the best teaching tools I've ever experienced for fair housing in a practical way. Can you share with us a bit about how Fairhaven came about, and maybe start with what it, for those in our audience that aren't familiar with it, tell them about what it is if they haven't had a chance to do it yet.
Absolutely. Thank you for the kind introduction and for having me with you today. Fairhaven is NAR's new online fair housing training. We released it this past November of 2020, along with our annual conference. Fairhaven is really a new approach to fair housing training. There isn't anything else like it. We decided to create it not long after publication of the Newsday investigation. Your members may be familiar with this investigation, a 3-year testing study conducted by a newspaper in Long Island, New York, to look at how the top real estate brokerages on Long Island treated testers posing as clients of different backgrounds. And what they caught on hidden camera was that real estate agents treated the white tester and the tester of color differently in 40% of interactions, almost half the time when the tester was Black. Agents showed them fewer listings. They steered them to different neighborhoods based on their race and national origin. They required some to be pre-approved to see listings and not others based on their race. They told them different things about crime in schools. I would encourage you, if you haven't watched the documentary yet, to check it out. It's called Long Island Divided. So we saw in more than one of those hidden camera videos an agent referencing their fair housing training. They said what they weren't supposed to do. They named it, and then they did it anyway. Something wasn't connecting. we decided we needed a new kind of fair housing training, one that teaches not only the substance of the law, but that would also move more agents to embrace it. So Fairhaven isn't your traditional lecture and quiz. There's no lists of laws and provisions to memorize. We want to give members a chance to practice applying fair housing principles in scenarios that feel real. As we developed Fairhaven, we reviewed real fair housing cases. We looked at frequently asked questions from real estate professionals about fair housing issues. And we discussed with members what scenarios they commonly run into so that we could create a simulation experience that feels as realistic as possible. Now, in addition to giving you a chance to practice applying fair housing principles, and this is Fairhaven's special sauce, this is what makes it different from other fair housing training, is that our goal was also to present powerful stories that affect your emotions. So as you move through this experience, you'll go through many scenarios. In most of them, you'll take the point of view of an agent, but sometimes we flip the script. Now you're a client. You're trying to buy a home and you're facing discrimination. And you will have to move through those scenarios and make choices that those clients might have to make in that situation, in what is essentially a no-win scenario. Despite your qualifications, you will not get the house. In those client scenarios, we follow them with video testimonials from real victims of housing discrimination. And we hope that you'll just get a little inkling of what it feels like, what the human impact of discrimination is, to open you up to see and maybe feel the harm that discrimination causes in real people's lives. So with this training, we're asking you to open your eyes and your heart, challenge some of your own biases, and motivate deep reflection and ultimately behavior change. The feedback we've gotten from the thousands of learners who have already completed Fairhaven has been overwhelmingly positive. We're very proud of what we've created here. It's available for free to all NAR members at fairhaven.realtor. We encourage all members to visit. It takes about 1 to 2 hours to complete.
Yeah, and I'm going to tell you, Alexia, I went out there and I'm probably, even though the CEO of this organization, I'm probably more like the typical realtor member who might go out there and say, okay, what's this about? And what's so special about this? And oh my goodness, an hour, 2 hours. And I'm going to tell you flatly, and I'm going to say it to the audience now, it was terrific. You hit a home run. You hit it on every level. And when I say especially giving those two different perspectives where you're kind of moseying along through it and then you're like, well, wait a minute, I'm going to flip this. And now you get to experience it as a client. And I was, I don't know, uninformed, arrogant enough, dumb enough to think that, oh, I'm going to, there's not going to be an issue here. And it was almost right away where I did not get the first sale, I think it was. And I'm like, oh, wait a minute. And so I'm telling you, I think you accomplished everything that you wanted to. I do have one question about it. So there are different, so depending upon your answers, there are different ways that Fairhaven goes, right?
That's right. It was created by these really smart learning designers at Ernst & Young Learning Labs. So each scenario has different pathways and different endpoints depending on your choices. So if you are doing well, and the goal in Fairhaven is to get 4 deals closed in 6 months. And if you're doing well and closing deals, you'll finish pretty quickly. But if you're struggling and you're not closing deals, and by the way, the way you close a deal is by making the choices that align with fair housing principles. If you're struggling and you're not closing deals, you're going to keep getting fed more scenarios and have more chances to practice. So that's why the amount of time it takes to complete is variable.
And that's another reason why I encourage people to go out and do this. Is this isn't someplace you go and then it tells you, oh, you're wrong about this, you're wrong about this, you're wrong about this. It helps you immediately figure out, which way you really needed to go there. I thought that the practical aspects of it were just, and frankly, it was entertaining. Let's be honest about it. It was entertaining. It was fun to do. Practical. Again, kudos to you guys. I'm really pleased. And so you said it was at Fairhaven.Realtor, right? So that's where everybody's got to go out to. And I know this has been a long commercial for it, but there's rarely the opportunity to unconditionally encourage people to do something like this. So great time, Fair Housing Month, to remind everybody to get out there. And like I say, once I got past that first part, I did all right. But anyway, let's go on and talk about some other things. And I want to dig behind the curtain just a little bit. First of all, I know that NAR has, obviously dedicates a lot of staffing and resources to fair housing, diversity, inclusion issues. How many staff people at NAR actually work on those type of issues?
Well, I am the only person at NAR who works on fair housing full time.
Okay.
We have a few other folks on our fair housing team who cover fair housing along with some other issues. So, for example, Brian Green, who was chief of fair housing enforcement at HUD, NAR snatched him away from HUD about a year and a half ago to become NAR's new director of fair housing, which is a position that did not exist before. And I used to work for Brian at HUD. That's where I learned fair housing, and that's how I crossed over from HUD into the realtor world. Brian has since been promoted, so he is now overseeing all policy development at NAR, not just fair housing, but now he's bringing that fair housing lens to all the policy that we develop. He still spends a good chunk of his time on fair housing, but he's working on all our other policy issues as well. We have another team member who took that director role, who spends part of her time on fair housing, but she also covers appraisal, FHA, VA, other federal financing issues. So that's our fair housing team. I'm the one full-time person. We have a couple of part-time folks. On DEI, we had the indomitable Fred Underwood, who hails from your area. He's just retired, but he was our full-time person working on diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're currently hiring to fill his role. Then we have some other folks who work on those issues part-time. We have a working group of about 40 people who weigh in on DEI issues so that we make sure that it's woven into the way we conduct all of our business. But in terms of full-time folks, there's really two of us. One, me on fair housing, and one on diversity, equity.
Yeah, and I think I was thinking about that, and thank you for answering the question, but I think where I was really going with this was it's so interwoven, right? Everything is so interconnected. So it's not like there aren't, 50 other things, right, that are going on at NAR that you're going to have to weigh in on, because there's some kind of fair housing ramification to it, and also for the DEI people as well, right? The diversity, equity, and inclusion people.
It's all connected.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, that makes a ton of sense to me. And I saw from your bio that your involvement in these types of issues, it's quite purposeful, obviously, on your part. Why is fair housing and its related issues so important to you?
Well, Jeff, it's how I was raised. My grandfather, Ned Smokler, was a member of the first racially integrated law firm in the United States in my hometown of Detroit. The family lore is that Papa Ned used to pose as a straw lessor to help Black lawyers get office space downtown back when they were barred from leasing offices because of their race. So I grew up with racial equity as a fundamental value that I learned from my family. I spent my first 10 years of life living in an integrated neighborhood in Detroit. Then I moved to a pretty white suburb where the other kids were absolutely shocked that someone like me, someone white, had lived in the city of Detroit. They had grown up hearing a story about the city of Detroit from their parents, from the media, that did not square with my experience living there. And that really had a powerful effect on me at that young age, that we lived in two different, completely disconnected worlds. And that something about that wasn't right. After college, I worked for a civil rights champion from Detroit, Congressman John Conyers Jr. And in law school, I focused on civil rights. And after law school, I got recruited into HUD's Fair Housing Office by Brian Green.
And you've continued with Brian now over to NAR, as you mentioned earlier. Okay, so now, all right, so I'm starting to connect this all up here a little bit. That makes some sense. Okay, and wow, what a fantastic story. What a fantastic story with that firm. Oh my goodness. So so let's talk a little bit now about, I want to dig into the issues a little bit. And what I want to help our audience understand is the long-term impact that segregation, redlining, other discriminatory policies have had on our communities. So can you dig into that for us a little bit?
Absolutely. One of my favorite quotes is from William Faulkner. He wrote, "The past is never dead. It isn't even past." This country that we live in, these segregated neighborhoods, this racial homeownership gap that is the same today in 2021 as it was 53 years ago when discrimination was legal. These things are not just the natural consequences of people's individual choices. They are the effect of explicit public policies that shut people out of thriving neighborhoods because of the color of their skin and shut them into neighborhoods where banks and the government refuse to invest, and where we cited polluting factories, railroad tracks, and highways, and other undesirable land uses. After the Great Depression, the federal government created a program to make mortgages and home ownership more accessible to millions of families. But the FHA limited its loans to neighborhoods that were deemed good investments, those with white, non-immigrant residents. From 1934 to 1968, FHA helped finance more than $120 billion worth of loans. 98% of that, think of that, 98% of that $128 billion went to white borrowers. And those maps, those redlining maps that the FHA used to determine which neighborhoods would get investment and which neighborhoods wouldn't, those dividing lines live on today. Look at maps where the COVID rates are the highest. Look at heat maps. They overlay those old maps almost exactly. Again, after World War II, the federal government made huge investments in home ownership. That was actually the time when our nation changed from one of renters to owners, a majority of home owners. The federal government financed the building of the suburbs and the interstate highway system to reach them, making cheap new homes available to returning World War II veterans, returning white veterans. Those new developments all had racially restrictive covenants written into their deeds, barring a Black veteran from moving into that neighborhood. You know, we venerate those World War II veterans as our greatest generation. And yet, millions of them were excluded from the benefits they earned because of the color of their skin. So my grandpa, now this is my other grandpa, not Ned, this is Grandpa David. He came back from liberating Paris with the US Army and bought a new house in a new subdivision. But somebody else's grandfather was not allowed to do that. My grandfather could build equity and pass that wealth down through my family. Other families couldn't do that. I say to my white friends, think about if your grandparents had not been allowed to buy a house or had been forced to buy a house in a neighborhood that wasn't thriving. Would your life be any different today? I think the connection from the past to the present is very clear. And I know that Evanston has been exploring its own history and reckoning with those lasting effects and trying to move toward remedying them. And though it may not seem like much money given the hundreds of years of history that we're reckoning with, it's a historic first step. Mm-hmm. So we can't rewrite history, but we can learn from it and we can build a better future.
Diversity, inclusivity, equity, we can all agree that these are morally important. And there may be, and you just mentioned in Evanston as an example, there may be disagreement about how to address these issues, but we can certainly obviously agree that the problems exist. Tough question here a little bit in the sense of, do you get complaints or pushback from any NAR members about the resources NAR is committing to this or the way that these problems are being addressed?
I will say, as a person who was a civil rights practitioner before I joined NAR, I was a little hesitant about joining this organization. Our history is tough. Mm-hmm. Our code of ethics once said it's unethical to treat people fairly. Mm-hmm. It's unethical to sell a home to a black person in a white neighborhood. You could be disciplined for that. That was our official policy for decades. And we opposed passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968. But what I have found since I joined this organization and the realtor world is tremendous support from people all over the country for this work that we're doing. Yes, there has been some pushback. When the former president of the United States made fair housing into a racially charged campaign issue, when NAR's 2021 President Charlie Oppler apologized for that history that I just mentioned, and just recently when we put the word equity on the cover of Realtor magazine with a story about reparations in Evanston and other places, we got some angry mail. But you know, Jeff, this whole country is on a journey when it comes to race. Our schools haven't taught, and a lot of people don't know about this history that we've just been talking about. And so we're doing our best to educate members, to bring them along this road, along this journey, and to go forward into a future where fully embracing fair housing is a fundamental part of wearing the R.
Well, and by the way, that's a fantastic answer. I mean, kudos to you on that one. All right, so obviously you're working on stuff other than Fairhaven, right? So let's go there, and let's start with NAR's Act, the Fair Housing Plan. What's that about?
So I mentioned the Newsday investigation. It came out in 2019, and it was really like a bomb fell. It rocked us, and we knew that we had to take action. Just 3 weeks earlier, Brian Green, who I've mentioned a few times, had come on board as our new director of fair housing policy. And he sprung into action with the leadership team to create this new fair housing initiative called ACT. which is an acronym. The A is for accountability, the C is for culture change, and the T is for training. So ACT is a package of industry reforms and tools for members, associations, and brokerages, shoring up our own house. Part of it is making sure that we hold real estate professionals accountable when they violate fair housing laws, but also we want to shift hearts and minds. And that's part of what Fair Haven is. So that equal service is just something that is woven into the way we serve the public. And so that when we say realtors hold themselves to a high ethical standard, upholding fair housing is core to that. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about ACT. The A is for accountability. We are creating a self-testing program for brokerages who want to voluntarily test themselves for discrimination. This will allow them to uncover and address problems before a newspaper or a private fair housing group does. They'll be tested, receive a confidential report of the findings, and then they'll have access to training or whatever other measures they may need to correct problems, if any. And I'll say that in the Newsday investigation, they tested 12 brokerages. There were findings against 10, but 2 of them had no findings. They figured out how to serve the public without violating the law. So this is not impossible. Mm-hmm. Also, on the accountability front, we're engaged in a review of the licensure laws of all 50 states, plus DC and 3 territories. We're looking at enforcement of fair housing violations and fair housing education requirements. We have found great variability among the states in what they require and how they enforce the law. And so we're going to be providing a set of best practices and a tool for state AEs to measure their own licensing laws up against the best practices and against other states. Now, the next 2 prongs of ACT, culture change and training, are interwoven. We're very excited about a new video series we've just launched of Realtor Fair Housing champions who embrace fair housing as part of their business strategy. We just premiered these at our April 15th Fair Housing Month event, hosted by Soledad O'Brien and featuring HUD Secretary Marcia Fudge. If you missed it, you can still find it on our Facebook page or on nar.realtor. We intend for those 3 videos to become the first in a series. So if you think you're a fair housing champion and want us to make a video about you, reach out to me and see what we can do. And we're going to be finding additional ways to acknowledge realtors who are fair housing leaders, to help shift the culture to one that applauds and celebrates fair housing. And then we're also introducing new and innovative training opportunities. So you've heard about Fair Haven. We also last June introduced a 50-minute training video on implicit bias in real estate, which is also available for free on our website. So implicit bias is the way that our brains automatically and often without our awareness associate stereotypes with people who are different from us. We all do it. It's the way our human brains work. It's a shortcut to help us categorize things quickly and make sense of all the information that's coming at us. But it can be a problem because a lot of those shortcuts aren't true. They're stereotypes that come from media and culture. So even as our conscious minds are holding up fairness and equal treatment as cherished values, our unconscious minds might be causing us to treat people differently or unfairly without our even being aware of it or intending it. So this training offers practical tools customized for the real estate context to help us identify and overcome these hidden biases so we can treat all customers fairly. Now, following up on that video, we're launching a 3-hour classroom course on implicit bias that goes even deeper with more exercises and tools. That's going to be offered for CE credit. We're currently piloting that in 3 states, and then we're planning a broader rollout across the country.
There is so much information that you're giving us here today. I'm just going to ask you a couple more questions because there's so much here that you've already given us to do that I'm just going to, a couple more things. Now, right before this podcast, we broadcast a presentation we did in partnership with other local associations here. It's called The Racial Wealth Gap in Homeownership. So I'm going to ask you for just a second to touch on the pieces of NAR's advocacy agenda that relate to closing that gap and making housing more accessible for first-time homebuyers.
So just the past few weeks, we have been making the rounds virtually on Capitol Hill and the White House with policy recommendations we developed with our partners in the Black Homeownership Collaborative. We worked in coalition with the National Association of Real Estate Brokers and a diverse group of partners ranging from the National Fair Housing Alliance to the Mortgage Bankers Association. We're all on the same page, pushing for a more equitable and accessible housing finance system to help more qualified buyers get access to mortgage credit. So this includes looking at things like alternative credit scoring models that take into account things like paying rent and utilities on time as indicators of creditworthiness. Right now, a lot of banks don't look at that when qualifying someone for a mortgage. We want to deal with the student loan debt that is disproportionately burdening young African Americans and delaying young people of all backgrounds from becoming homeowners. You know, young people today have way more student loan debt than their parents or grandparents had. And that can really delay them from buying a house. We're pushing to increase the housing supply to tackle this inventory shortage that's pushing prices up and out of reach for so many families, especially families of color. And we're advocating for increased funding for down payment assistance, home ownership counseling, and foreclosure prevention.
Nicely done. Yeah, so there's a lot on the agenda for sure, a lot that's being worked on. Is there anything I've forgotten to ask you about? Here's your chance to leave our audience with a message of your choice.
Sure. All right. Well, the first thing is do no harm. Make sure you understand your legal obligations. Make sure you have policies in place so that you are treating every client the same. Help the client lead you. Don't make assumptions. Check yourself for your hidden biases. And also stand up for your clients if something feels off. Treat everyone fairly. First, do no harm. But second, repair the harm. The Fair Housing Act made discrimination illegal, but it didn't provide a remedy for the systems and structures that were already in place that deprived so many qualified buyers from becoming homeowners over generations. What can you do in your community to expand homeownership opportunities to those who have been historically shut out? What can you do to support neighborhoods in your city that have been systematically disinvested over decades by public and private policy? One final note. Implicit bias training teaches that the number one thing you can do to stop thinking about people stereotypically is to form lasting interpersonal relationships with people across lines of difference. Not just at work. Get out of your comfort zone. Expand your circle. Make a new friend. Make lots of new friends. I think that's a good note to end on.
Yeah, I think that's a great note to end on. Alexia, thank you so much for for taking the time to talk with me and our audience for a few moments. I feel so much smarter about this after having spoken to you. And on behalf of NASBAR and our audience, I express our appreciation for the great work you're doing for all of us.
Thank you, Jeff. It's been so fun to be with you today. And, it's a real privilege to be able to do this work for the realtors.
That's a wrap. Please keep an eye on NASBAR Communications to stay current on NASBAR happenings and to know when one of our great podcasts is coming up. Thank you, Bradley Laberman, for the great job of running the board. And thanks to you for tuning in to Raising the NSBAR. I very much appreciate it. Please stay safe, and let's hold out a little while longer to beat this pandemic. Talk to you soon.